My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I was born on March 14, 1988, in a small place called Bondokui in the Mohun province of Burkina Faso. If you had seen me as a child, you would not have imagined that one day I would stand before people speaking about life, death, and something beyond both. I was raised in a land where hardship was not a story, it was a daily reality. We did not grow up with certainty. We grew up with questions. Questions about food, about safety, about tomorrow. But even in that uncertainty, there was something else. There was dignity. There was faith. And there was a quiet belief that Africa, our Africa, was not meant to remain broken. As I grew older, I chose the path of a soldier, not because I loved war, but because I believed in protection. I believed that someone had to stand between chaos and the innocent. By the year 2021, I was serving as an artillery officer in the Burkina Faso army. I was stationed near the border between Mali and Burkina Faso. If you have never been to the Sahel region, it is difficult to explain what it feels like. It is a place where the horizon is wide, but the future often feels narrow. Narrow, narrow, narrow. A place where the land is dry, but the violence is constant. That region had become one of the most unstable areas in the world. In just 1 year, there were more than 2,000 recorded terrorist attacks. Armed groups moved like shadows. Names like JNIM and ISGS were no longer distant threats. They were part of our daily conversations, part of our reality. We lived with the understanding that death was never far away. You could be speaking with a man in the morning, and by the evening, he would be gone. Not from illness, not from age, but from violence. And yet, despite all of that, I believed I was on the right path. I believed that what we were doing mattered, that we were not just fighting enemies, but defending a future. A future where children could go to school without fear. A future where farmers could plant without hearing gunfire in the distance. A future where Africa would stand on its own feet without being bent by outside forces. That belief gave me strength. It gave meaning to the long nights and the constant tension. It allowed me to carry the weight of responsibility without breaking. But there are moments in life when your deepest beliefs are tested, not slowly, not gently, but suddenly, completely. There comes a moment when everything you think you understand is taken from you, and you are left with nothing but truth. That moment came to me in a way I could never have imagined. It did not come during a speech. It did not come during a victory. It came in the darkness, in the middle of the night, in the middle of war. Before that night, I thought I understood fear. I thought I understood death. I thought I understood faith. But I did not. Not fully. Because there is a difference between believing something and experiencing it. There is a difference between speaking about death and crossing its boundary. There is a difference between praying to God and standing in His presence. What I am about to share is not something I learned from a book. It is not something I was taught in school. It is not something I can prove to you with documents or records. It is something I lived. Something I remember with a clarity that no passage of time has been able to erase. There was a day when my life did not just change. It stopped. Completely. There was a moment when my heart no longer beat. When my body lay still. When those around me believed I was gone. And in that moment, I was taken somewhere else. Somewhere beyond the battlefield. Beyond pain. Beyond time. I did not expect it. I did not ask for it. But it happened. And what I saw there, what I heard there, changed everything I thought I knew about this world. It changed how I see leadership. It changed how I see suffering. It changed how I see Africa. And most importantly, it changed how I see my purpose. For a long time, I remained silent about this experience. Not because I forgot, but because I understood how it might sound. I understood that many would question it. Some would doubt it. Others would dismiss it completely. And I do not blame them. If I had not lived it myself, I might have done the same. But there comes a point when silence becomes heavier than speaking. There comes a point when what you carry inside is not meant to stay hidden. Because it is not only for you, it is for others. That is why I am speaking now. Not to convince you, not to force belief, but to share truth as I experienced it. You are free to accept it or not. That is not my role. My role is simply to tell you what happened. To tell you what I saw. To tell you what was said to me. And to tell you why I believe I was allowed to return. Because what I received was not meant for me alone. It was a message that reaches beyond borders, beyond religion, beyond culture. A message that, if understood, could change not only Africa, but the world. Before I continue, I ask you for one thing. Do not listen with judgment. Do not listen with fear. Just listen with an open mind, because what I am about to share began on a night that should have been like any other. A night of duty, a night of vigilance, a night of survival, but it became something else entirely. It became the night I died, and the night I was sent back. If you are ready, I will take you there. The night of August 17th, 2021 began like many other nights we had endured. There was no sign that it would become the most important night of my life. At around 2:30 in the morning, the air was still, too still. Those of us who had spent enough time in the Sahel knew that silence could sometimes be more dangerous than noise. Silence meant waiting. Silence meant something was about to happen. Our base was located in Djibo, in the Soum province. It was one of the most fragile zones in Burkina Faso, a place constantly under pressure, a place where the line between control and collapse could shift in a single night. We had been on high alert for weeks. Reports had come in about increased movements from armed groups. There were whispers of coordination, whispers of something larger than the usual attacks. But in war, whispers are constant, and you cannot react to all of them. If you did, you would never rest. That night, I was not sleeping deeply. No soldier truly does in a place like Djibo. You close your eyes, but your mind remains awake. You listen, even in your dreams. Then it happened. A sound that did not belong to the night. A sharp crack. Not distant. Close. Too close. Before my mind could fully understand it, the ground beneath us trembled. And then came the explosion. It was not just loud. It was overwhelming. It consumed everything. The air itself seemed to tear apart. I did not see the explosion. I felt it. A force so powerful that it lifted my body and threw me through the air. Later they told me it was about 5 to 7 meters, but in that moment, there was no measurement. Only impact. Only chaos. I remember a flash, a brightness that lasted less than a second, then darkness. Complete darkness. But before that darkness took me fully, there was something else. Confusion. Not fear. Not yet. Just confusion. Because everything had changed in an instant. The place where I had been standing no longer existed in the same way. Structures had collapsed. Voices were shouting. Gunfire erupted almost immediately after the blast. This was not a single attack. It was coordinated. Planned. Precise. We later learned that the enemy had used improvised explosive devices, heavy machine guns, and even surveillance drones to guide their assault. This was not random violence. This was strategy. And what made it worse, what made it even more difficult to accept, was what we discovered afterward. There had been betrayal. Someone within our own ranks had given information. They had revealed the location of our weapons storage. They had exposed our vulnerabilities. In war, you expect danger from outside. You prepare for it. You train for it. But betrayal from within, that is something different. That is something that cuts deeper. Because it breaks trust. And without trust, even the strongest defense becomes fragile. But in that moment, I did not know any of this yet. All I knew was the explosion, the force, and then nothing. There was no gradual fading, no slow loss of consciousness. It was immediate, like a switch being turned off. 1 second I was there. The next, I was gone. I did not feel pain. Not in that moment. I did not feel fear. There was no time for it. Everything ended too quickly, too suddenly. And that is something I want you to understand. When people speak about death, they often imagine it as something prolonged, something you can prepare for, something you can process. But sometimes, it is not like that at all. Sometimes, it arrives without warning, without explanation, without permission. And in that moment, all the plans you had, all the thoughts you carried, all the things you believed you would still do, disappear. Just like that. I did not think about my family. I did not think about my country. I did not think about my mission. There was no time for reflection. There was only interruption. A complete break between what was and what came next. If you had looked at my body at that moment, you would have seen a soldier lying among debris. You would have seen destruction. You would have seen the cost of war. But what you would not have seen was that my story had not ended. Because even as my body lay there, something else was beginning, something I could not have imagined, something that would take me far beyond the battlefield. That explosion did not just destroy structures. It broke the boundary between life and something beyond it. And I crossed that boundary without knowing it, without choosing it, without understanding it. If you think that night was about violence, you are only seeing the surface. Because what happened next had nothing to do with weapons, nothing to do with strategy, nothing to do with war. It was something deeper, something spiritual, something that would force me to question everything I thought I knew. But before I can take you there, you need to understand what happened to my body after that explosion. Because while I was no longer aware of it, others were. My brothers in arms, the men who fought beside me, the men who refused to leave me behind. They saw what I could not see. They carried what I could not feel. And what they later told me was something that even now I struggle to fully accept. What I am about to tell you is not something I witnessed with my own eyes. It is something that was told to me later by men I trust, by men who had no reason to lie, men who had seen death before many times and were not easily shaken. And yet, when they spoke about what they found that night, there was something different in their voices, something heavier, something that did not sound like an ordinary report from the battlefield. After the explosion, chaos spread through the base. Gunfire echoed in every direction. Orders were shouted, some heard, some lost in the noise. Smoke filled the air, thick and blinding. Pieces of concrete, metal, and dust covered everything. In that confusion, my absence was not immediately noticed. That is the reality of war. No one counts in the first moments. Everyone reacts. Everyone survives. But after the initial wave of attack began to slow, after positions were stabilized, after the immediate threat was pushed back just enough, they began to look for the missing. My name was one of those called. There was no answer. At first, that was not unusual. Many soldiers go silent during combat. But as time passed, concern began to grow. A small team was sent to search the area where I had last been seen. What they found was not a clear path. It was destruction. Part of the structure near our position had collapsed completely. Heavy concrete slabs had fallen over what used to be our shelter. The ground itself had been torn open by the blast. It did not look like a place where someone could survive. Still, they searched, because that is what soldiers do. We do not leave our own behind. They began to move debris piece by piece, slowly, carefully, calling out my name, listening for any response. But there was nothing, no voice, no movement, only silence. Then one of them saw something, a part of a uniform, buried under broken concrete. They cleared more of the debris, and then they found me, or what they believed was my body. Later, when they described it to me, they did not rush their words. They spoke carefully, as if even speaking about it required strength. They told me I was lying under the rubble, partially covered. My face was burned on one side. Not completely, but enough that it was clear the explosion had been very close. 2 fingers on my left hand were gone. Not damaged, gone. They could not be found. My ribs were broken. At least 4 of them. They said my chest looked uneven, as if it had collapsed inward. My right leg was the worst, an open fracture. The bone had broken through the skin. There was blood, a lot of it, too much. They said I had lost a dangerous amount of blood, enough that, even without everything else, survival would have been unlikely. But what affected them the most was not the injuries themselves. It was the stillness. They told me I was completely motionless. No reaction, no sign of awareness, nothing. They checked for breathing. It was weak, barely there, so faint that at first they were not sure. They checked for a pulse. It was unstable, irregular, fading, and yet they did not give up. They pulled me out from under the debris, carefully, despite the urgency. They carried me across the broken ground, through smoke and dust, back toward the field medical station. Time was against them. Every second mattered. They reached the station at around 3:05 in the morning. Medics were already overwhelmed. Multiple casualties. Limited resources. Decisions had to be made quickly. Who could be saved? Who could not? That is one of the hardest realities of war. You do not always have the luxury of trying everything for everyone. You must choose. But they did not leave me aside. They placed me on a table. They began to work. They tried to stabilize my breathing. They tried to control the bleeding. They tried to respond to injuries that, even under the best conditions, would have been difficult to treat. Minutes passed, but my condition did not improve. It worsened. My pulse became weaker. My breathing became more shallow, until finally, there was nothing. At 3:27 in the morning, the military doctor made a decision no one wants to make. He checked again, carefully, professionally, and then he said the words that mark an ending: cardiac arrest, clinical death. In simple terms, my heart had stopped. I was no longer alive. For those around me, that was the conclusion. There was no doubt, no confusion, no hidden hope. They had seen it before, many times, and they knew what it meant. I was gone. Some of them stepped back. Some remained still. Some could not look for long, because even in war, even when death is common, it never becomes normal when it is someone you know, someone you have spoken with, someone you have shared moments with. That is something I want you to understand. War does not make people cold. It tests how much warmth they can keep. And that night, those men felt loss, real loss. But here is where the story begins to change. Because while they stood there, believing that my life had ended, my experience was not ending. It was beginning. What they saw was a body without life. What I experienced was something entirely different. Because in that moment, when my heart stopped, I became aware again. Not in the way you might expect. Not with pain. Not with confusion. But with something else. Something lighter. Something that cannot be explained by the body. What they called death was, for me, a transition. And the next part of this story is the most difficult to describe, because it is the moment when I was no longer inside my body. The moment when I saw something that changed everything. What I am about to describe is the part that even I struggled to accept when I returned. Not because it was unclear, but because it was too clear, too real. More real, in some ways, than the world we are used to. The last thing I remember before everything changed was the explosion, the force, the sudden break in awareness, and then silence. Not the kind of silence you hear at night, not the absence of sound that we experience in quiet places. This was something deeper, a silence that felt complete, total, as if everything that made noise, war, fear, pain, thought had been turned off at once. And in that silence, I became aware again, but something was different. The first thing I noticed was the absence of pain. My body, which had been broken, burned, and torn, no longer hurt. There was no weight, no pressure, no struggle to breathe, no tension. It was as if everything that had been heavy had been removed. I felt light, not just physically, but completely, as if something essential had been lifted from me. Then I became aware of movement, not movement in the way we understand it, with steps or effort, but a kind of drifting, a gentle pull. At first, I did not understand what was happening. There was no fear, only curiosity, a quiet awareness that something had changed. And then I looked down. That is when everything became undeniable. Below me, I saw the battlefield, the same place where the explosion had happened, the same broken structures, the same scattered debris. But now, I was not in it. I was above it, looking down, and then I saw something that stopped all thought. I saw my own body, lying there, still, unmoving, partially covered in dust and fragments of concrete. At first, my mind tried to understand it in a normal way. I thought perhaps I was dreaming. Perhaps this was confusion. But the clarity of the image made that impossible. I could see details. I could recognize everything. There was no distortion, no blur. It was real, completely real. And yet, I was not in that body anymore. That is a moment that is difficult to explain, because it forces you to confront something directly, the separation between who you are and the body you live in. I realized in that moment that the body I had always identified as me was not actually me. It was something I had used, something I had lived through. But now, I was outside of it, and I was still aware, still thinking, still myself. That realization did not bring panic. It brought clarity. a kind of understanding that did not come from reasoning, but from direct experience. I understood without being told that I had crossed a boundary, the boundary between life as we know it and something beyond it. As I continued to observe, I noticed something else. There were movements around my body. Soldiers, my brothers, they were searching, calling out. I could see their urgency, their effort. I could see them pulling away debris. I could see the moment they found me. I watched as they lifted my body, carefully, with determination, and yet they did not see me. They did not see the part of me that was watching. That is another realization that stays with me. The understanding that what we see of each other is only part of the truth. There is something more, something that cannot be touched, something that cannot be destroyed in the same way. As I watched them carry my body away, I felt something begin to change again. The connection between me and the scene below started to fade. Not suddenly, but gradually, as if distance was being created, even though I was not moving in a physical sense. And then I felt it, a presence, not visible yet, but undeniable, a force, not violent, not controlling, but guiding. It did not push me. It did not pull me harshly. It simply drew me, gently, like a current you do not resist, like something that knows where you need to go. I did not question it, not because I had lost the ability to question, but because there was no reason to. There was no fear attached to it, only a sense of rightness. As that presence guided me away, the battlefield became less distinct. The noise faded completely. The images softened, until eventually, they were gone, completely gone, and I was no longer connected to that place, no longer connected to the destruction, no longer connected to the body I had left behind. I was moving into something else, something I had never experienced before, something that did not feel like a place in the way we understand places. There was no ground beneath me, no sky above me, no direction in the way we define it, and yet, I was not lost. I was not drifting without purpose. I was being taken somewhere, somewhere intentional, somewhere prepared. The transition did not feel like travel. It felt like unfolding, like moving from one state of awareness into another. And as this happened, a new environment began to reveal itself. At first, it was not clear, just a sense of brightness, a softness, a presence of something that was not there before. And then slowly it became more defined, more real, more alive. I began to understand that I was entering a space unlike anything I had ever known, a space where the rules of the physical world no longer applied, a space where time did not feel the same, where distance had no meaning, where existence itself felt different. I cannot say exactly when the transition was complete. There was no moment of arrival like stepping through a door. It was more like awakening into something new, something already there, waiting. And when I became fully aware of where I was, everything changed again. Because what I saw next was not darkness, not emptiness, but something filled with light, a light unlike anything I had ever seen. And yet, it did not hurt my eyes. It did not overwhelm me. It welcomed me. When the battlefield disappeared, it did not feel like I had left something behind. It felt like something had been lifted away from me. The noise, the weight, the tension of war, all of it was gone. And what remained was something I had never experienced before in my life. At first, there was only light, but not the kind of light we know from the sun or from fire. It was softer, gentler. It did not shine on things. It seemed to come from everything. It surrounded me without blinding me. It touched me without pressure. And within that light, there was peace. A kind of peace that is difficult to explain with human words. Because in our world, peace is often temporary. It is something we feel for a moment, then lose. But this was different. This was complete. There was no anxiety hiding beneath it. No fear waiting to return. No tension in the background. It was absolute. For the first time in my life, I felt what it meant to exist without fear. Not courage in the face of fear. Not strength despite fear. But the complete absence of it. And in that absence, there was clarity. My thoughts were not scattered. They were not racing. They were calm, focused, almost as if they were no longer coming from effort but from understanding. Then I became aware of something else, Sound, but not sound in the way we know it. There were no instruments, no voices speaking in language, and yet there was something like music, a harmony, a flow. It was as if the space itself was alive with meaning. Every vibration carried something, not just noise but understanding. It is difficult to describe because it was not heard with ears. It was perceived in a different way, a deeper way. And that sound, if I can call it that, brought comfort. It made the space feel not empty but full of presence, full of purpose. As I became more aware, I realized something important. There was no sense of time, not in the way we experience it on Earth. There was no before, no after, no waiting. Everything simply was, and yet it did not feel static. It felt alive, like a continuous moment that never ended. I did not feel the need to move, but I also did not feel trapped, because movement itself did not seem necessary. Where I was enough. I want you to understand something clearly. This was not a dream. It did not have the confusion or instability of dreams. Everything was stable, consistent, more real than anything I had known before. In fact, if I compare it honestly, the world we live in now feels less solid than that place did. That realization stayed with me even after I returned, because it changed how I see reality itself. As I stood or existed in that space, I felt something grow within me. Not emotion in the usual sense, but a deep sense of belonging, as if I was exactly where I was supposed to be, as if nothing was missing, as if, for the first time, everything made sense. There was no need to ask questions, because the need for answers had disappeared. Everything felt understood, not explained but known. And yet, even in that completeness, something began to change. Not in the environment, but in my awareness. I felt that I was not alone. At first, it was only a feeling, a quiet certainty that there was another presence. Not distant, not hidden, but not yet visible. It did not create fear. It created anticipation, because whatever was there felt familiar. Not in a way I could connect to a memory, but in a way that felt deeper than memory. Like something I had always known, even if I had never seen it before. Then, slowly, the light began to shift. Not fade, but focus, as if it was making space for something to appear. And from within that light, a form began to emerge. At first it was not clear, just a shape, a presence becoming visible. And as it came closer, details began to take form. A human figure, calm, peaceful, approaching without urgency, without force. There was no fear in me, only a deep sense of recognition. The closer this figure came, the stronger that feeling became. Not recognition of the face, but recognition of the presence. And then I saw the face clearly, and in that moment, I understood, not through reasoning, not through teaching, but instantly, the kind of understanding that does not require explanation. It was him, the one whose name is known across the world, the one spoken of in churches, in prayers, in stories passed through generations. Jesus. He stood before me, not as a distant figure from history, but as a living presence, real, near, and filled with something I had never encountered before. Love. Not the kind of love we speak about casually, not the kind that changes with circumstance, but something deeper, something constant, something that did not need to be proven, because it could be felt completely. His eyes, that is what I remember most. They were not just looking at me, they saw me, completely, every part of me, every decision, every fear, every strength, nothing hidden, and yet there was no judgment in them, only understanding, only compassion, only truth. I did not fall to my knees. I did not speak immediately, because in that moment, words felt unnecessary. Everything that needed to be communicated was already known. He did not rush toward me. He did not demand anything. He simply stood there, present. And that presence alone was enough to change everything. Then, slowly, he moved closer. And as he did, I felt something shift within me again. Not fear, not confusion, but purpose, as if this meeting was not random, as if there was a reason I had been brought there. a reason that was about to be revealed. When he reached me, he did something simple, something quiet, but something that carried more meaning than any words could. He placed his hand on my shoulder, and in that moment, everything began to unfold. When his hand rested on my shoulder, it was not a physical weight like the touch of another human being. It was something deeper, a connection, a certainty. It felt as though everything within me had become still, not because I was forced to be still, but because there was no longer any need for movement, resistance, or doubt. In that moment, I knew without question who stood before me. No one told me his name. He did not introduce himself. And yet there was no confusion. It was the same way you recognize truth when you encounter it directly. It does not need explanation. It simply is. I had heard of Jesus my entire life. Like many in Africa, I grew up surrounded by stories of faith, stories told in churches, in homes, in quiet conversations between elders, stories about sacrifice, about love, about redemption. But hearing about someone and standing in their presence are not the same, not even close. Everything I had ever heard about him felt small compared to what I experienced in that moment, because he was not distant, he was not abstract, he was not an idea, he was real, standing in front of me. And what struck me most was not his power, it was his calm. There was no force in him, no display meant to impress, no need to prove anything. And yet, everything about him carried authority, not the kind that demands obedience, but the kind that makes obedience feel natural, because it comes from truth. His face was gentle, not weak, but peaceful. His expression held a depth I cannot fully describe. It was as if he understood everything I had ever been and everything I could become. His eyes held mine, and in them I felt something I had never truly experienced before. Not even in moments of deep human connection. It was complete acceptance. Not approval of every action I had taken, but acceptance of who I was, of my journey, of my struggles, of my imperfections. And within that acceptance, there was love, a kind of love that did not ignore truth, but embraced it fully. I did not feel exposed. I did not feel ashamed. I felt seen, and that changed everything. For a moment, I did not think about war. I did not think about my injuries. I did not think about the fact that my body lay lifeless somewhere far away. All of that felt distant, irrelevant, because what mattered in that moment was this presence, this encounter, and the understanding that it was not an accident, that I had been brought here, that this meeting had purpose. He did not speak immediately, and yet communication was already happening, not through words, but through something deeper, a kind of knowing that passed directly into me. It is difficult to explain because it was not language, but it was clearer than language, and in that silence, I began to understand something important. He knew why I was there. He knew everything that had happened. The explosion, the battlefield, my life, my beliefs, my doubts. Nothing was hidden. Nothing needed to be explained. And yet, he did not overwhelm me with that knowledge. He did not confront me. He did not accuse. He simply stood with me. That alone was enough to create a sense of trust deeper than anything I had ever known, because it was not forced. It was not demanded. It was given freely. After what felt like both a moment and an eternity, he moved slightly, not away from me, but beside me. His hand remained on my shoulder, and with his other hand he gestured forward. There was no urgency in the movement, no dramatic action, just a simple indication, as if to say, look. And when he did that, everything changed again. The space around us did not disappear, but it transformed. Not in a way that removed the light, but in a way that gave that light shape, form, meaning. Images began to appear, not like projections, not like something separate from reality, but as if reality itself was revealing something hidden within it. At first, I did not understand what I was seeing, but as the images became clearer, recognition began to form. Faces, place, moments. And then I realized these were not random images. These were lives of men who had carried the weight of leadership, men who had stood in difficult times, men who had chosen paths that were not easy, men whose decisions had shaped nations. And as I looked closer, I began to recognize them. Names I had heard before, names that carried history, names that carried both praise and controversy. But here, in this place, they were not defined by how the world judged them. They were revealed in a different way. In truth, in purpose, in sacrifice. I understood, without being told, that what I was about to see was important, not just for me, but for what I had been brought here to understand. This was the beginning of a message that would unfold step by step, and each part would carry meaning. Each part would demand reflection. Each part would challenge what I thought I knew. I did not speak. I did not interrupt, because I knew this was not a moment for questions. It was a moment for seeing, for receiving. And as the first image became clear, I understood that what he was showing me was not about the past alone. It was about the future, my future, Africa's future, and the choices that would determine which path becomes real. When he gestured forward, the light around us did not disappear. It transformed. It became something that carried images within it. Not flat images like we see on a screen, but living moments. Moments that moved, that breathed, that carried emotion and consequence. I was not just watching them. I was inside their meaning. The first figure I saw stood with a posture that was both firm and humble. He was young, but there was weight in his presence. Not the weight of power, but the weight of responsibility. I recognized him almost immediately. Thomas Sankara, a man from my own country, a name that had never disappeared from our history. But what I saw here was not the version spoken about in politics or debates. This was something deeper. I saw him in moments of decision, moments when he could have chosen comfort, but chose sacrifice instead. I saw him rejecting corruption, not because it was popular, but because it was necessary. I saw him standing before his people, not as a ruler above them, but as someone among them. There was no distance in his leadership. He did not hide behind privilege. He lived simply. He worked with his own hands. He believed that a nation must stand on its own strength. I saw fields being cultivated, not by foreign systems, but by local hands. I saw children receiving vaccines, millions of them, not as an act of charity, but as an act of responsibility. And in those moments, I understood something clearly. Leadership is not measured by how much power you hold. It is measured by how much you are willing to give. Sankara was not perfect. I could see that too. There were struggles. There were mistakes. There were moments of tension and opposition. But what defined him was not perfection. It was intention. It was the willingness to stand for something greater than himself. And then the image shifted, not abruptly, but naturally. As if one story was leading into another. Another man appeared, older, calm, carrying a presence shaped by suffering, but not broken by it. Nelson Mandela. I saw him not as the symbol the world celebrates, but as a man in moments of trial, moments when anger could have consumed him, moments when revenge would have been justified in the eyes of many, but he chose something else. He chose restraint. He chose unity. I saw the weight of years spent in confinement. Years that could have hardened his heart. And yet, when he emerged, he did not carry hatred. He carried vision, a vision that saw beyond division, a vision that refused to let the pain of the past define the future. I saw a nation standing on the edge of collapse, and I saw a man choosing to hold it together, not with force but with understanding. That is something I had not fully understood before. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes, the strongest choice is the one that refuses to break others, even when you have the power to do so. Then again, the scene shifted. A third figure appeared, Kwame Nkrumah, a man whose name had echoed through Africa's struggle for independence. But what I saw here was not just a political leader. I saw a dreamer, a man who believed that Africa was not meant to be divided into weakness. I saw his vision of unity, not as an idea spoken in speeches, but as something he truly believed could become real. I saw the effort to build something greater than individual nations, a sense that Africa, as a whole, had a destiny that had not yet been fulfilled. There were moments of success, moments of hope, but also moments of resistance, moments when that vision faced obstacles from both within and outside the continent. And again, I understood something. To lead is to face resistance, not because you are wrong, but because truth often challenges what people are comfortable with. As these visions unfolded, I began to see a pattern. These men were different. They lived in different times. They faced different challenges. They made different decisions. But there was something they shared. something that connected them beyond history. They did not lead for themselves. They led for something greater, for their people, for a future they might never fully see. They were not perfect. None of them were. And that was important for me to understand, because perfection is not what is required. What is required is commitment to truth, commitment to justice, commitment to something beyond personal gain. As I absorbed these images, I felt something within me begin to shift, not just understanding, but responsibility, because I knew, even before he spoke, that this was not just a lesson about the past. It was a message about the present, about what leadership is meant to be, and what it must become. Then, for the first time since he had appeared, Jesus spoke, not loudly, not with force, but with a clarity that carried weight beyond volume. He did not speak many words, but the words he spoke stayed with me. He made me understand that leadership is not about control, it is about service. That power, when disconnected from truth, becomes destruction, and that a leader who forgets the people loses everything, even if they appear to gain the world. I felt those words not just in my mind, but in my entire being, because they were not abstract. They were connected to everything I had just seen, everything those men had lived, everything they had sacrificed. And in that moment, I began to realize something deeper. This vision was not only to show me what had been done right, it was to prepare me for what could go wrong, because the light began to shift again, and the peace I felt remained. But something else began to emerge, something heavier, something darker, a contrast that made what I had just seen even more meaningful. I understood that what was coming next would not be as comforting, but it would be necessary. As the final image of those leaders faded, the light did not disappear, but its tone changed. It was still present, still surrounding me, still carrying that deep sense of peace. And yet, something else entered the space. A weight, not a physical weight, but something I felt within my awareness. A heaviness that did not bring fear immediately, but prepared me for something difficult. Jesus did not remove his hand from my shoulder. That alone gave me strength, because even before I saw what came next, I knew I would not face it alone. Then slowly, the light revealed another vision. And this time, it was not a reflection of the past. It was something else, something that had not yet fully happened, but could. The first image that appeared was a village. At least, it had once been a village. I could see the remains of homes, burned structures, collapsed walls, ash covering the ground like a second layer of earth. There was no movement at first, no voices, only silence. But this silence was not peaceful. It was empty, a silence left behind after destruction. Then I saw figures, people moving slowly through what remained. Their steps were heavy, their bodies thin, not just from hardship, but from prolonged suffering. Children walked among them, and what I saw in those children stayed with me more than anything else. Their bodies were weak. Their faces carried something that children should never carry. Not just hunger, but loss. A loss that had come too early, too suddenly, too often. I saw a mother trying to comfort a child who had nothing left to eat. No food, no water, no certainty of tomorrow. And I felt something within me tighten, because this was not unfamiliar. This was Africa, but worse, much worse. The vision expanded. It was no longer just one village. It was many, scattered across the land, connected not by roads, but by suffering. I saw displacement, people moving with no destination, carrying what little they had left, walking not toward hope, but away from danger. And even that movement offered no guarantee of safety, because danger followed them. Violence had not ended. It had spread. I saw armed groups moving through the land, not as isolated threats, but as a constant presence, a force that had grown stronger, more organized, more destructive. There were no clear lines anymore, no defined areas of control, only instability, only fear. And then, something else appeared in my awareness, not as a voice, but as knowledge, numbers, not spoken but understood. More than 30 million people in the Sahel facing hunger, millions displaced, entire regions collapsing under the weight of conflict, drought, and neglect. And I realized something with a clarity that shook me. This was not just a vision of possibility. This was a warning, a direction the world could take. if nothing changed, if the same patterns continued, if leadership failed, if truth was abandoned, I looked at the faces of the people in that vision, and I understood something deeper than statistics. Each number was a life, a family, a story interrupted, a future erased before it could begin. This was not just about poverty. It was about dignity being stripped away, about people being reduced to survival without the chance to live. I felt something rise within me, not anger in the way we usually feel it, but something stronger, a refusal, a deep, undeniable rejection of what I was seeing. Because in that moment, I knew this was not how things were meant to be. Africa was not created for this. Its people were not born for this. This was not destiny. This was consequence. The result of choices. Choices made by leaders, choices made by systems, choices made by those who had power and those who misused it. I turned slightly, not physically, but in awareness, toward Jesus. I did not need to speak, because the question was already within me. Why would this happen? And more importantly, can it be changed? He did not respond immediately with words, but I felt his understanding, a depth that held both truth and compassion. Then he spoke, and his words were not long, but they carried weight that I cannot fully express. He made me understand that this future was not fixed. It was not something that must happen. It was something that could happen. If people continued to walk away from truth, if leaders chose power over service, if nations allowed themselves to be controlled instead of standing with dignity, if the vulnerable were ignored, if children were forgotten, this was the path of neglect, the path of compromise, the path of silence in the face of injustice. And it led here. To this, to suffering on a scale that could have been prevented. I felt the weight of that realization deeply, because it meant that what I was seeing was not just a warning, it was a responsibility. Then he said something that I will never forget, something that did not feel like a general statement, but something directed at me, clear, personnel, unavoidable. He made me understand that I could not stand aside, that I could not return to life unchanged, that I had been shown this for a reason, because someone must stand between what could happen and what must not happen. And in that moment, I understood something that changed me completely. Leadership is not a position. It is a responsibility to prevent suffering when you have the power to act. It is the courage to stand when others hesitate. It is the willingness to choose the difficult path because it is the right one. The vision began to fade, but its impact did not, because what I had seen was now part of me. It could not be ignored. It could not be forgotten. And I knew, even before the next moment came, that what I was about to receive next would define everything that followed. When the vision of suffering faded, the space around us returned to that calm, luminous stillness. The light was still there. The peace was still there. But I was no longer the same as I had been when I first arrived. Something inside me had changed. Not gradually, but completely. Because once you have seen what I saw, you cannot return to ignorance. You cannot pretend that the future is something distant, something abstract. It becomes real. It becomes urgent. I stood there, aware of his presence beside me, still feeling his hand on my shoulder, still feeling that connection that went deeper than anything physical. And in that moment, I understood that what would come next was the reason I had been brought there. This was not just an experience. It was a message, a responsibility, a calling that I had not chosen, but could not refuse. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud. It did not echo. And yet, it carried more weight than any command I had ever heard in my life. It was clear, direct, unavoidable. He said to me, in a way that did not require translation, "You must be the one who does not allow this to happen." Those words did not feel like a suggestion. They were not a possibility among many. They were a responsibility placed directly in front of me. I did not feel overwhelmed in that moment. I felt certain. Because when truth is presented clearly, it does not confuse you. It clarifies everything. And then, he gave me 4 things. Not as a list spoken slowly, but as truth that entered me all at once. Clear, sharp, impossible to misunderstand. The first was this: lead with truth, not with power. I understood immediately what this meant. Power can control people, but truth guides them. Power can force obedience, but truth creates trust. And without trust, no nation can stand. I saw in that moment how many leaders fall into the trap of power. How easy it is to begin with good intentions and slowly become consumed by control, by influence, by the desire to hold on to authority at any cost. But truth does not behave that way. Truth does not need to be protected by force. It stands on its own. And if a leader abandons truth, then everything they build will eventually collapse. The second truth came just as clearly. Do not sell your nation to outside forces. This struck me deeply, because I knew exactly what it meant. Africa has long been a land rich in resources, but poor in control over those resources. Decisions made far away have shaped the lives of millions. Agreements signed in comfort have created suffering on the ground. And too often, those in leadership have allowed it, sometimes for personal gain, sometimes out of fear, sometimes because they believed there was no other way. But what I understood in that moment was that there is always a choice, and that choice defines the future of a nation. To surrender control is to surrender dignity. To trade independence for convenience is to weaken the foundation of everything, and a nation without dignity cannot stand strong. The third truth followed. Protect the poor and the children first. This one did not need explanation, because I had just seen what happens when they are not protected. I had seen the hunger, the suffering, the loss, and I understood that the strength of a nation is not measured by its wealth, but by how it treats those who have the least. If children suffer, the future suffers. If the poor are ignored, the nation becomes hollow. Leadership is not about serving those who are already strong. It is about lifting those who cannot stand on their own. And if that is neglected, then everything else becomes meaningless. The fourth truth was the one that stayed with me in a very personal way. Do not fear being alone, because the right path is often walked by few. In that moment, I understood something I had not fully accepted before. To do what is right often means standing apart. It means making decisions that others will not understand. It means facing criticism, resistance, even isolation. Because truth does not always align with what is popular. And those who challenge systems are rarely welcomed at first. But that does not make the path wrong. It confirms it. And in that moment, I felt something settle within me, a readiness. Not because I knew everything that would come, but because I knew what was required of me. And that knowledge was enough. I did not ask him how I would do it. I did not ask for guarantees, because I understood something important. The mission was not about comfort. It was not about ease. It was about responsibility. And responsibility does not come with guarantees. It comes with purpose. We stood there for what felt like a long time. But again, time did not exist in the way we understand it. It was not measured in minutes or hours. It was measured in understanding, in clarity, in transformation. And when I had received everything he intended to give, I felt a shift again, subtle but undeniable, as if the moment was reaching its conclusion, as if something was about to change. I did not want to leave, not because I feared what would come next, but because what I felt there was something beyond anything I had ever known. And yet, I understood that I was not meant to stay. Not yet. There was still something left for me to do. Something that could not be done in that place, only in the world I had come from. And as that realization settled within me, I heard something, not from the environment, but directed toward me, a voice, clear, final, and filled with purpose. Not yet. Those two words marked the turning point, because in that moment, I knew I was being sent back. When I heard the words, not yet, something shifted immediately. Not around me at first, but within me. It was like a quiet understanding that the moment I was in, as powerful and complete as it felt, was not meant to continue. There was no resistance in me, no attempt to hold on, because deep inside, I knew that what I had received was not meant to remain there. It was meant to be carried back. But before the return fully began, there was something I became aware of in a way I had never experienced before. Time, or rather, the absence of it. Up to that point, I had not questioned how long I had been in that place. There was no need to. Nothing was changing in a way that required measurement. Nothing was passing. Everything simply existed in a continuous state of presence. But when I began to understand that I would return, the idea of time reappeared. And with it came a realization that I still struggle to explain even now. What I experienced there felt long, not in minutes or hours, but in depth. It felt like a journey, a complete process, something that could not have happened quickly. I had seen visions. I had received understanding. I had stood in the presence of something beyond this world, and it felt full, complete, not rushed, not compressed. And yet, when I later returned and heard what had happened on the battlefield, I was told that from the moment my heart stopped to the moment it began again, approximately 2 hours had passed. 2 hours, a period of time that, in our world, feels measurable, limited, defined. But what I experienced in that same span did not feel like 2 hours at all. It felt like something far greater, not longer in the sense of duration, but deeper in the sense of experience. It is difficult to put into words, but I will try to explain it in a simple way. In our daily lives, time feels like something we move through. We go from one moment to another. We measure, we wait, we anticipate. Time controls how we act, how we plan, how we think. But in that place, time did not control anything. There was no waiting. There was no past or future in the way we understand them. Everything I experienced happened in a kind of continuous present. And within that present, there was space for everything that needed to happen. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was delayed. Everything occurred exactly as it was meant to. That realization changed how I see time even now, because I began to understand that what we experience as time is not as fixed as we believe. It is part of our world, part of how we function, but it is not the only way existence can be experienced. And more importantly, it is not what defines meaning. 2 hours in our world can feel like nothing, or they can change everything. It depends on what happens within them. And in my case, those 2 hours contained something that reshaped my entire life. I did not think about clocks while I was there. I did not count moments. But when I returned and I was told the time, it struck me deeply because it confirmed something I had already felt, that what I experienced was not bound by the same limits. And that made me understand something even more important. Life, as we know it, is limited. Our time here is measured. We wake, we act, we rest, and eventually we leave. And because of that, we often believe that time is what gives value to our lives. But what I experienced showed me something different. It is not time that gives value. It is what we do within it. It is the choices we make, the truth we follow, the lives we affect. A short life lived with purpose can carry more meaning than a long life lived without it. That understanding became clear to me not through theory, but through direct experience. And it stayed with me as I began to feel the transition back. Because the moment of return did not feel like something I initiated. It felt like something that was happening to me, gently but firmly. The light that had surrounded me began to change completely, but move further away, as if I was being drawn out of it. The sense of weightlessness began to shift, very slightly at first, then more noticeably. I could feel something returning, not immediately painful, but heavier, denser, like moving from something open and limitless into something confined. And with that came awareness. Awareness of the body, the physical form I had left behind. At first, it was distant, like remembering something rather than experiencing it, but it grew stronger, closer, until I understood clearly what was happening. I was going back to the battlefield, back to the body that had been broken, back to a world where pain, time, and limitation existed again. And even though that meant leaving behind something perfect, I did not resist it, because I understood now that I was not being sent back without reason. I was being sent back with purpose. The experience I had just lived was not meant to stay in that place. It was meant to continue here, through action, through decision, through leadership. As that understanding settled within me, everything began to move faster, not in the sense of speed, but in the sense of transition. The connection to that place grew thinner. The connection to my body grew stronger, until there was only one thing left to happen: the return itself. And that moment was not gentle. It was sudden, immediate, and impossible to ignore. The transition did not end slowly. It ended all at once. One moment, I was still aware of that place of light. The next, everything collapsed into something else. There was no gradual return, no gentle landing. It was immediate. And the first thing that came back was weight. A heaviness so intense that it felt like I had been dropped into something solid after being completely free. My awareness narrowed. Instead of being open, it became focused, compressed. And then pain, sharp, overwhelming. Every part of my body seemed to speak at once, not in words, but in sensation. My chest burned. My leg throbbed with a deep, relentless intensity. My side felt tight, as if something inside it had broken and refused to settle. It was not one pain. It was many, layered together, returning all at once. I tried to move, but I could not. Not because I chose not to, but because my body would not respond. It felt distant, heavy, as if I had been placed back into something that no longer fully obeyed me. Then came sound, not the harmony I had experienced before, but sharp, urgent voices. Voices filled with tension, with effort, with disbelief. I could not understand everything at first. The words came in fragments, shouts, commands, names. But one thing was clear. They were trying to save me, even though by all understanding, I had already been gone. I forced my eyes to open, not easily. It felt like lifting something heavy, but slowly, light entered again. Not the same light I had left. This light was harsher, more direct, and it revealed something very different. I was lying on a bed, a simple one, surrounded by people in uniform, medical personnel, soldiers, faces I recognized, but could not fully focus on yet. Everything felt slightly distant, as if I was still not completely back. One of them leaned closer. I could see his expression change. Shock, disbelief, and then something else. Relief. He said something. I do not remember the exact words, but I remember the tone. It was the tone of someone who had not expected to see what he was seeing. I tried to speak, but my voice did not come. My throat felt dry, weak, as if it had not been used for a long time, which, in a way, it had not. My breathing was uneven, shallow at first, then stronger, painfully strong. Each breath reminded me that I was back in a body that had been damaged, and yet, I was alive. That realization did not come immediately. It came slowly, as awareness returned piece by piece. I was no longer in that place of light. I was no longer outside my body. I was here, back in the world of weight, sound, and limitation, back in the world of time. Later, they told me what had happened from their side. After the doctor had declared me clinically dead, they had not immediately stopped. Some of them refused to accept it. They continued working, trying, helping, even when there was no sign of response. Minutes passed, then more. At some point, something changed. A small sign, a movement, a reaction, enough to make them try again. And then, my heart began to beat again, weakly at first, but it returned. Life returned. And what they could not explain was how, because by every measure they knew, it should not have happened. Too much damage, too much time, too many reasons for the body to stop completely. And yet, I was there, breathing, opening my eyes, returning from a place they could not see. Some of them later told me that they had never witnessed anything like it, that it did not make sense, that it went beyond what they understood medically. But for me, there was no confusion, because I knew where I had been, I knew what I had seen, and I knew why I had come back. Even though my body was broken, something inside me was stronger than it had ever been before, not physically, but in purpose, in clarity, in understanding. I did not fear death anymore, not because I believed I could avoid it, but because I had seen what lies beyond it, and that changed everything. What I feared instead was something else, not completing what I had been given, not living in alignment with what I had been shown, not using the time I had been returned for the purpose it was meant to serve. As I lay there, unable to move, unable to speak clearly, surrounded by people trying to stabilize me, I made a decision, not spoken, not announced, but absolute. If I had been given another chance to live, then that life would not be the same as before. It could not be, because I had seen too much, understood too much, received too much. And that changes a man in a way that cannot be reversed. The pain remained. The injuries remained. The long process of recovery was still ahead of me, but something else remained too. The message, the vision, the words, and they did not fade with time. They became clearer, stronger, more present with each passing day. When I opened my eyes that morning, I was alive, but I was not the same man who had closed them. At first, the change was quiet, hidden beneath the pain, beneath the confusion of recovery, beneath the physical struggle to survive each hour. My body demanded attention. Every movement reminded me of the injuries I had sustained. My ribs ached with each breath. My leg required time, care, and patience I was not used to giving. Even the simple act of sitting up became a challenge. And yet, none of that defined me anymore, because something deeper had shifted, something that no wound could touch. In the days that followed, I listened carefully to what the doctors and soldiers told me. They spoke about my condition in terms they understood. Severe trauma, critical blood loss, cardiac arrest. They explained how unlikely it was that I had survived. Some of them used words like impossible. Others chose softer language, but their meaning was the same. They could not explain it. And I did not ask them to, because I already knew that what had happened to me could not be measured only by what they had seen. They had seen a body, but I had experienced something beyond the body, and that difference changed everything. At first, I did not speak about it, not because I doubted it, but because I understood how it might sound. I understood that people trust what they can see, what they can test, what they can prove, and what I had experienced did not fit into those categories. It was real, but not in a way that could be demonstrated. So I kept it within me, not as a secret, but as something I needed to understand more deeply before I could share it. During that time, I began to observe my own thoughts, and I noticed something immediately. Fear had changed. Before that day, I had accepted fear as part of life. As part of being a soldier, you learn to live with it, to manage it, to move forward despite it. But after what I had experienced, the fear of death itself was gone, not reduced, not hidden, gone, because I had seen that death is not the end we imagine it to be. It is a transition. And knowing that removes something fundamental from your mind. It removes the illusion that everything ends when the body stops. And once that illusion is gone, you begin to see life differently. But something else replaced that fear. Something I had never felt before in such a clear way. A concern, a responsibility, a weight that did not come from danger, but from purpose. I was no longer afraid of dying. I was afraid of failing. Not failing in the way people usually think. Not failing to succeed, to achieve, to gain recognition, but failing to do what I had been shown I must do. Failing to act on the truth I had received. Failing to stand when it was necessary. That fear was not paralyzing. It was motivating. It pushed me forward. It kept me focused. It reminded me constantly that my time, however long it would be, was not given back to me for comfort. It was given back to me for action. As my body slowly recovered, my mind became clearer, and the memories of what I had experienced did not fade. They became sharper, more precise, as if they were not meant to be forgotten. I remembered the light, the peace, the presence of Jesus, the visions, the words. Each part remained intact, not like a dream that fades when you wake up, but like something that had been placed inside me permanently. And with that clarity came a new way of thinking. I began to see leadership differently. Before, I had understood leadership in practical terms. Strategy, coordination, decision-making under pressure. All of those things still mattered, but they were no longer the foundation. The foundation had changed. Leadership, I now understood, is not about control. It is about responsibility. It is about truth. It is about service. And most importantly, it is about the people who are most vulnerable, the poor, the children, those who cannot protect themselves. Because if they are forgotten, then everything else loses its meaning. I also began to see my country differently, not as a place defined by its struggles, but as a place filled with potential, a place that had been shaped by history, by external pressures, by internal challenges, but not defined by them. I saw Burkina Faso not as a victim of circumstance, but as a nation that could choose its path. And that realization brought both hope and responsibility, because choosing a path requires courage. It requires sacrifice. It requires standing firm even when it is difficult. And I knew, from what I had been shown, that the easy path is often the wrong one. As time passed, I could no longer remain silent. Not because I wanted attention, not because I wanted to convince anyone, but because I understood that what I had experienced was not given to me for myself alone. It was meant to be shared, not forced upon others, but offered, so that those who hear it can reflect, can consider what it means for their own lives. I do not ask anyone to believe me without question. That is not my intention. Belief cannot be forced, but truth, when spoken honestly, has its own way of reaching those who are ready to hear it. And if even one person hears this and begins to think differently, begins to see leadership differently, begins to understand responsibility in a deeper way, then speaking becomes necessary. That is why I am telling you this now, not as a story meant to impress, not as something meant to create fear or wonder, but as something real, something that happened, something that changed me, and something that I believe carries meaning beyond my own life. Because what I was shown was not only about me, it was about Africa, about its future, about the choices that must be made, and about the role each of us plays, whether we realize it or not. If you have followed me this far, then you already understand that this story is not just about what happened that night. It is about what must happen next, and that is something I will speak about now. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after, not gradually, not quietly, but completely. For me, that moment was the night I died, and the morning I returned. Everything that came before that night now feels like preparation. Everything that came after feels like responsibility. I do not stand before you as someone who has all the answers. I do not claim to understand everything about what I experienced. There are parts of it that remain beyond words, beyond explanation. But there is one thing I am certain of. What I saw was real, and what I was told matters. Not just for me, but for anyone who is willing to listen. I have thought many times about why I was allowed to return, why my life did not end on that battlefield like so many others, why I was given another breath, another chance, another path. And the answer that comes back to me is always the same. Purpose, not comfort, not recognition, not power. Purpose. There is something we often forget as human beings. We believe that our lives belong to us completely, that our time is ours to spend as we choose, that our decisions affect only our own path. But what I experienced showed me something different. Our lives are connected. Our choices extend beyond ourselves. And when we are given the ability to lead, to influence, to act, we are not given privilege. We are given responsibility. I speak now not only as a man who survived something unusual, but as someone who was shown what can happen if we continue to ignore what is right. The vision I saw was not a distant possibility. It was a warning, a future shaped by neglect, by compromise, by silence. And that future is not limited to Africa. It is a reflection of what happens anywhere in the world when truth is abandoned, when leaders serve themselves instead of their people, when the vulnerable are forgotten, when nations trade their dignity for temporary gain. These are not African problems. They are human problems. And that is why this message matters beyond borders. To those who are listening, especially those who have lived long enough to see how the world changes, you understand something that many younger people are still learning. You understand that leadership matters, that values matter, that decisions made today shape the lives of those who come after us. You have seen nations rise and fall. You have seen moments of unity and moments of division. And because of that, you know that what I am saying is not distant. It is real. The world does not become better by accident. It becomes better when people choose to act with truth, with integrity, with courage. And that is not limited to presidents, to governments, to those in visible positions. It applies to every person. Because leadership begins in the way we live, in the way we treat others, in the way we respond to injustice. You do not need a title to lead. You need responsibility. You need truth. And you need the willingness to stand when it is easier to remain silent. I was told not to fear being alone. And I understand now why that matters. Because the path of truth is not always crowded. It is not always supported. It is often questioned, sometimes resisted. But that does not make it wrong. It makes it necessary. There will always be pressure to choose what is easy, to accept what is convenient, to avoid what is difficult. But the future is not built on convenience. It is built on decisions, and those decisions require courage. Africa, like many parts of the world, stands at a crossroads, not just politically, but morally, spiritually, humanly. We can continue to follow patterns that have brought suffering, or we can choose something different, something better, not perfect, but honest, not easy, but right. And that choice does not belong only to leaders. It belongs to all of us, because a nation reflects its people, and a people reflect their values. I do not ask you to believe my experience without question. That is not necessary. What matters is not whether you accept every detail of what I saw. What matters is whether you understand the message within it. To live with truth, to act with responsibility, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to refuse to surrender what is right, even when it is difficult. If you take nothing else from my words, take this. We are not here only to exist. We are here to act, to stand, to build something that goes beyond our own lives. And that requires intention. It requires awareness. It requires a decision to live differently. I believe that every person who hears this message has a role to play, no matter how small it may seem, no matter how unnoticed it may be, because change does not begin with large movements. It begins with individual decisions, with moments where someone chooses truth over comfort, where someone chooses courage over fear, where someone chooses to care when it would be easier not to. If you are listening to this now, take a moment, reflect, not on me, but on yourself, on your choices, on your influence, on what you stand for, because that is where this message truly belongs. And if what I have shared with you has moved something within you, even slightly, then do not ignore it. Let it guide you. Let it challenge you. Let it remind you that your life has meaning beyond what you see every day. And if you feel that this message is worth sharing, then share it. Not for me, but for those who may need to hear it. Speak about it. Reflect on it. Let it become part of a larger conversation about what truly matters. Because the world does not change through silence. It changes through truth spoken and lived. I do not know how long my life will continue from this moment forward. No one does. But I know this. Every moment I have been given now is not mine to waste, and neither is yours. May the world move toward what is right. May Africa rise with dignity, strength, and truth. May we all find the courage to choose what is good, even when it is difficult. And may we never forget that the future is not something that happens to us. It is something we create. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and what I have spoken to you comes from truth as I have lived it. I am Ibrahim Traoré, a servant of my people, and these words are not imagined but experienced. I am Ibrahim Traoré, and I carry this message not for myself, but for all who are willing to hear it.